In 2009, the popular true crime TV show Cops just happened to be in South Florida filming when a truly diabolical crime was committed there. And so cops captured this crime on camera. But someone in their footage was hiding something. And when you know what that something was, it becomes very obvious when you watch. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once or twice every week. So if that's of interest to you, please ask the like button if you can borrow their car for the week, and then when they say yes, spend that week driving around picking up as much roadkill as possible and packing it into their trunk. Picking up as much roadkill as you possibly can and pack it into their back seat in their trunk and then return the car. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. Michael DiPolito grew up in a very rough neighborhood in South Philadelphia where violence, drugs, and prostitution were just normal parts of everyday life. At a young age, like his parents, Michael became an alcoholic. He also developed a very serious drug addiction that he paid for by selling drugs. Michael would eventually drop out of high school, and not long after that, he became homeless and was living out on the streets, sleeping in abandoned buildings at night to stay warm. In 1993, when Michael was still in South Philadelphia, he was arrested for the first time. He was charged with possession of an unknown drug as well as intent to distribute this unknown drug. Court records don't specify what drug this was. However, Michael just did not show up for court, and so a warrant was put out for his arrest. Michael would somehow manage to evade police capture, and by 1997, he had fled South Philly altogether and landed in South Florida in a town called Boca Raton. Shortly after arriving there, Michael was arrested for a second time, this time for offering an undercover police officer $15 in exchange for sex. Michael would plead guilty to soliciting prostitution, however, he would just get released. A year after the prostitution arrest, Michael was sued by a former girlfriend named Karen Tan, who claimed he was the father of her son, and so he owed her child support, and Karen had a DNA test that backed up this claim. However, Michael, again, would just not show up for court, and before long, Karen just gave up and dropped the lawsuit. Michael was likely very relieved when this happened, because at the time, he was making almost no money through a temp agency. And so after this lawsuit gets dropped, Michael decides, I need to go out and make some real money. And somehow, on his quest to find a more lucrative opportunity, Michael was introduced to associates of the Bonanno family. And the Bonanno family is one of the infamous 5 families that dominates organized crime across the United States. They are literally the Italian mafia. And after the mafia met Michael, they took a liking to him, and they did offer him a more lucrative, albeit illegal, opportunity. They gave him a role inside one of their so-called boiler rooms. A boiler room is not literally a boiler room. Instead, it's a group of fraudsters that use high-pressure sales tactics to steal money from unsuspecting victims. Typically, the way it works is the fraudster will cold call someone, and they will tell them that they have this great get-rich-quick scheme, but you gotta give me your money right now if you want to be a part of it. And so when the victim says, okay, that sounds great, and they wire the money along, the fraudster just steals their money. Michael, who was very charismatic and a natural salesman, got really good at tricking people into giving him their money. And so eventually, Michael realized he could make a lot more money if he started his own boiler room, where his commission could be much higher on the money he stole. And so fairly abruptly, he left the mafia's boiler room. We don't really know how they reacted to this. And Michael would set up not 1, but 2 boiler room scams of his own in South Florida. And by 2002, he had pocketed $155,000 of stolen money. However, he had spent virtually all of it on fancy hotels and cars and phone sex. But the good times would not last for Michael, because in 2002, the police caught on to Michael's boiler room scams and they raided them, and Michael was arrested for a third time, except this time he would go to court, he would stand trial, and he would be sentenced to 2 years in prison, 28 years of probation, and he would be ordered to pay back the $155,000 that he stole. Michael would only serve 7 months of his 2-year jail sentence, but that was more than enough to leave a huge impact on him. Michael hated prison. He hated every second of it. And so during those long sleepless nights that he was laying awake in his cell, he made a promise to himself that when he got out, when he was released, he would never, ever come back. And so in 2003, when he was released, he immediately entered a sobriety program. He also started going to the gym every morning, and he began studying for his GED, which is a high school equivalency test because he didn't get his high school diploma. After he successfully earned his GED a couple of months later, he would also start a legal business. It was a digital marketing firm that was called Mad Money Inc. Over the next several years, Michael would do his very best to stay on the straight and narrow and not get in trouble. And for the most part, he did that. By 2008, Michael was still sober, despite a few setbacks, and he was still very focused on his physical fitness and his health, and his business, Mad Money, was doing quite well, earning him nearly $100,000 a year. But his love life had become a bit messy. Michael had gotten married back in 2007 to his longtime girlfriend named Maria Luongo, who had stood by him when he went to jail. But that year, in 2008, when Michael was 38 years old, he cheated on Maria with a 26-year-old real estate agent named Dalia Mohammed, who he met at a Starbucks. And instead of their affair being a quick fling, as they likely both intended it to be, Michael and Dalia quickly fell in love. And when that happened, Michael went to his wife Maria and he told her, and then he divorced her. Just 3 days after the divorce finalized, Michael and Dalia went to the courthouse and they got married. The newlyweds would move into a brand new condo that Michael had purchased for them in Boynton Beach, which is a beautiful town in South Florida. And for a time, their life was perfect. They knew it was a little outrageous the way they had met each other and how quickly they had fallen for each other, but they didn't care. They got along great and they were excited about the future. But their perfect life would not last long. On the evening of March 12th, 2009, so only about a month after they had gotten married, Michael and Dalia were at home in their condo when they heard a knock on the front door. And so Michael went to the door, he opened it up, and much to his surprise, standing on the other side was his probation officer, and behind him was a whole bunch of police officers. And before Michael could even ask what was going on, the probation officer told Michael that they had received an anonymous call tipping them off that Michael was selling steroids and ecstasy pills and other drugs out of his condo. Michael would tell the probation officer that there was no way that was true. He is not selling any drugs, he's sober, he's not doing that. And so eventually Michael just stepped aside and said, "Please come in, search my condo, I have nothing to hide." And so sure enough, the police, they would go into his condo, they would search it, but they wouldn't find anything and they would leave. And so after the police had gone, Michael and Dalia found themselves just standing in their condo, completely dumbfounded. But instead of trying to get to the bottom of it right then and there about who had called and why, they just decided it was best for them to just leave their condo for the night and go stay at a nice hotel. And so they packed up some bags, they left their condo, which was a total mess from the police search, and they went to the hotel and they had a nice night together. The next morning, when they got up and headed down to the parking lot, they saw up ahead, standing around Michael's car, was Michael's probation officer as well as several other police officers. And so Michael and Dalia are looking at each other like, what is this, again? And so they hustle on over to Michael's car, and before they can even plead their innocence to Michael's probation officer, he stops Michael and just says, "Look, we got another anonymous call, this time telling us that you are selling drugs out of your vehicle, and so we need to search it." And so Michael is just totally beside himself, but he says, "Look, go ahead, search it. There's nothing in the car." And so sure enough, the police would open up his car, they'd rip it apart, but again, they wouldn't find anything. Over the next couple of weeks, the only thing Michael and Dalia ever wanted to talk about was what the heck was going on. Who is placing these anonymous calls claiming that Michael was selling drugs out of the condo and out of the car? It just didn't add up. They wanted to believe that this was all just one big mistake, but in the back of both of their minds, they were thinking about Michael's very checkered past and his previous dealings with the mafia and with people he had clearly ripped off. And so maybe there was someone in his past that was looking to get back at Michael and maybe get him arrested and sent back to jail. Fast forward to March 29th, so 17 days after that first raid on their condo, and that night, Michael and Dahlia had been eating dinner at a restaurant, and when they left and headed out to the parking lot, once again, standing around Michael's car were several police officers clearly waiting for him to return. And so without even needing to ask why they were there, Michael and Dahlia, they go over to them and they just start pleading with them to understand that this is a setup. We do not have drugs in this car. We don't know what's going on here. Please, you gotta understand that someone's doing this to us. But this time, when they searched his car, they would find something. Before we go any further, I want to tell you about today's sponsor, Experian. Back when I was just a young buck in college, I was broke. And so naturally, I took out a credit card with a $5,000 limit and immediately maxed it out on buffalo chicken calzones and beer. Now, as soon as my card got declined, I didn't pay it off. Instead, I just took the card, tucked it back into my wallet, and forgot about it. But the bank did not forget about my $5,000 debt, and my failure to pay it back wrecked my FICO score. A FICO score is a type of credit score. Over the last 10 years, I've been able to rebuild my credit score, but it has been a slow and painful process. And so my suggestion to you is to avoid the unpaid beer and calzone credit trap and just closely monitor your credit score. And with Experian, you can do that for free. In addition to closely monitoring your credit score, they will also send you alerts anytime your credit changes. Experian also offers a dark web scan. If you've ever been the victim of a data breach, and you may not know if you have or not, your information potentially could live in the dark web, and that's a place where criminals could use it to commit fraud, and if that happens, it'll wreck your credit along with a bunch of other horrible things, unless you catch it and report it. And on that, if you do find inaccuracies on your credit report, you can easily submit disputes and track those disputes on Experian's online dispute center. It is time to take charge of your credit. Get Experian credit monitoring, alerts, your FICO score, and that dark web scan all for free. Just go to Experian.com/MrBallen. Again, that's EXPERIAN.com/MrBallen. Okay, back to the story. After searching Michael's car, the police would find a small bag of cocaine stuck inside of a cigarette carton tucked underneath his spare tire in the trunk. And when Michael saw them pull the cocaine out, he began to cry because he knew, even though it was not his and he had not put it there, that he was going to jail because he was going to get arrested for possession and he was on probation and he was screwed. And so he just begins crying and pleading with police to understand that the cocaine was not his. He swears it's not his. Meanwhile, Dahlia, she's looking at the drugs and now she's second guessing herself. Is Michael lying? Is he actually selling drugs? And he's been lying to me too? But when she sees her husband crying hysterically and looking so sincere, she believes that he's got to be telling the truth. And so pretty soon she was standing beside Michael and pleading with police as well to let them go, that this was totally just a setup. And amazingly, these police officers who were aware of the previous raids on Michael and Dahlia's property, they told them, look, we do think this is pretty suspicious that somebody keeps calling in about you selling drugs and now magically the drugs are in your car. And so what we're going to do is we're going to confiscate this cocaine. We're not going to arrest you. Instead, go home, be safe, call us if you see anything strange, you hear anything strange, and we're going to begin investigating to figure out who is making all of these calls. And so Michael and Dahlia were totally relieved to hear this, but at the same time, they were kind of terrified because clearly whoever was looking to get Michael in trouble now was prepared to break into his property in order to do it. And so what was stopping them from breaking into their condo and planting drugs in there as well? And so after these police officers left, Michael and Dahlia hopped in the the car, they sped back to their condo, and they went inside and they searched it top to bottom, looking for any sign that anyone had recently been in there, or if there were drugs or anything illegal inside of their condo. And after looking and finding nothing, they just locked their doors, shut their windows, shut the blinds, and just prayed that the police would be able to quickly identify who was doing this to them and make them stop. But over the next few months, the police would not figure out who this anonymous caller was because the caller stopped calling. And so for a little while, Michael and Dahlia were convinced that the whole ordeal was over and done with, and they basically returned to their normal lives. But on August 5th, 2009, roughly 4 months after the cocaine was found in Michael's car, the anonymous caller would come back with a vengeance. On that morning at around 5:45 a.m., Dahlia left the condo, leaving Michael in bed, and she headed out to the local gym to get a workout in. Around 6:30 in the morning, she stepped off the treadmill and she looked at her phone and she saw she had a missed call from a number she didn't recognize, and this number had left her a voicemail. And so she calls her voicemail, she puts it to her ear, and as she's listening, her heart starts to race because it was a Boynton Beach detective telling her there had been some sort of incident at her condo and she needed to come back right away. Terrified, Dahlia grabbed her things and she ran out of the gym, she got in her car, and she called this number back. And when the detective picked up, she tried to get more information from him about what this incident was, what happened. And the detective would only say that it involved her husband, and he would explain everything when she came back. And so in a total state of shock, Dahlia turned on her car and she sped out of the parking lot and she headed back towards her condo. And when she turned onto her street and saw her condo, she hit the brakes and just stared. In front of her condo were all these police cars with their lights on, and police officers were walking around, and yellow crime scene tape was lining the outside of her property. And inside of the taped off area, there were all these crime scene photographers taking pictures of her condo. And so as Dahlia is sitting in her car at the top of the street, just staring at this crazy scene she's seeing, one of the Boynton Beach police officers sees her and walks up, and after confirming that she was Dahlia DiPolito, he said to her, leave your car here and come with me. And so Dahlia, who knows obviously something bad has happened but really doesn't know the extent of it, she puts her car in park, she gets out, and she begins walking with this police officer over towards this cluster of 3 people that are standing right in front of her property. And it would turn out one of them was the detective who had called her on the phone. And so Dahlia's led over, and that detective, as soon as he sees Dahlia, he walks over to her and he says to her very matter-of-factly that someone had called about a disturbance in their condo, and shots were fired, and unfortunately her husband, Michael, was dead. Dahlia, who was totally hysterical, was gently led away from her condo into a nearby police car, and they would drive her to the police station where they would sit her down and begin asking her questions about her husband. And they would say to her, look, I know you just found this out, but we gotta figure out what could have happened because a killer is on the loose. We need to find this person and stop them. And so at first, the conversation was really just Dahlia crying and the detective kind of calming her down. But eventually, she would tell the detective about the anonymous caller who kept calling the police and claiming Michael was selling drugs, and how she and Michael suspected that, probably the anonymous caller was connected to someone from his past, maybe someone from the mafia, or maybe one of the victims of his boiler room scam, or it could be any number of other people that Michael had done wrong in the past. And so the detective, he's taking diligent notes and he's listening to Dahlia, and then at some point in a break in the conversation, he says to Dahlia, okay, it's time to get serious. I need to know if you know this guy. And so Dahlia, she was kind of looking down and she looks up, confused what he's talking about. And then the door opens and this huge guy in handcuffs walks into the room.
Come here. Bring this guy in here. Get over here. Get over here. You know who this guy is?
No.
You've never seen him before?
I've never seen him before. Ever.
Do you know her?
Put your head up and look at her.
Put your head up.
I've never seen him.
What were you doing coming out of her house? Get him out of here.
It would turn out Dahlia was lying. She did know who that guy was. Almost immediately after marrying Michael 6 months earlier, she had stolen $200,000 from him, but apparently that wasn't enough for her. She needed the rest of Michael's money as well as his condo. And so she had been the anonymous caller. She was the one calling the police and tipping them off that Michael was selling drugs out of the condo and out of his car. She was the one who planted the cocaine in the back of his car because she wanted him to get arrested because he was on probation and he would go back to jail for a really long time. But when her efforts failed and Michael did not get arrested and so did not go back to jail, Dahlia moved on to plan B. She reached out to one of her ex-boyfriends and she asked him, "Hey, do you know any hitmen that could murder my husband?" And the ex-boyfriend at first didn't think she was serious, but when she kept asking him about it and began offering to pay and really was making it clear that she wasn't joking around, the ex-boyfriend basically told her, "No, I don't know any hitmen." And then he, the ex-boyfriend, called the Boynton Beach Police Department and told them about Dahlia and her plan to hire a hitman to kill Michael. And so when the Boynton Beach Police Department found out about this plot, they immediately had one of their undercover agents pose as a hitman and set up a meeting with Dahlia. And so the undercover agent was that huge guy in handcuffs that was led into the room with Dahlia. And so Dahlia goes to meet the undercover agent, the fake hitman. She gets into his car and there's a hidden camera in the back seat that's filming her the whole time. And she's caught on camera saying she wants to kill her husband. She gives money to the undercover agent. And then as she's about to get out, the agent turns to her and he says, "Are you sure you want to do this? Because as soon as you leave, it's done. I am going to kill Michael and you can't stop it." This is Dahlia's reaction.
There's no changing, no, there's no, like, I'm determined already. I'm positive, like, 5,000% sure, like, no, when I say I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it. Like, as soon as you told me, listen, I need the money from you, I went, I grabbed it right away, like, we were good to go. Like, with me, you're not going to have a problem, you're not going to have an issue.
And so the Boynton Beach Police Department, they have all this information about what Dahlia thinks is going to happen, and they decide they can use this information to set her up in the most elaborate way possible. And it just so happened the very popular true crime TV show, Cops, was filming in the area. And so the Boynton Beach Police Department allowed Cops to be a part of this elaborate setup. So they got to film everything that happened. So on the morning of August 5th, Dahlia got up and left her condo at 5:45 a.m. and headed to the gym, knowing, at least in her mind, that the hitman would be coming to her condo right after her, breaking in and shooting her husband twice in the head, because that was the plan they had come up with that was captured on film. And so after the police see her leave at 5:45 a.m., because they were monitoring the condo, they rushed in, they knocked on the door, and they got Michael to come downstairs. And he had no idea his wife was trying to kill him. And so he comes to the door, he's totally confused, but he goes with them and he's kind of ushered off to the police station. And then for about the next hour, the police set up a very convincing fake crime scene right out front of the condo. And then once it was all set up, that detective called Dahlia and left her a voicemail saying that, there's been this incident, you need to come back to your condo. And then a couple of minutes later, when Dahlia called them back and said, "Okay, I'm coming back to the condo now," that's when the TV crews for the Cops TV show, they kind of set up in the bushes and got ready to film what happened next.
Listen, we had a report of a disturbance at your house, and there were shots fired. Is your husband Michael? Okay, I'm sorry to tell you, ma'am, he's been killed. He's been killed, man. I'm sorry.
No, he's not.
Listen.
No.
Try to calm down.
No.
Listen,
No.
right now we need to get you to the station.
No.
We need to get you to our police station.
I want to see him.
I can't let you in, man. We have to do our job.
After the fake hitman was pulled out of the interrogation room after Dahlia had said, "Oh, I don't know who he is," the detective just stared at her in total silence for a minute. And then he broke the news that he totally knew all about her murder plot and that she was going to jail.
You're going to jail today for solicitation of murder. You're under arrest. That's an undercover police officer. Everything has been recorded. You were photographed in the convertible when you sat in his car in the front of CVS. What do you want to do? What do you want to do here?
I didn't do
Dahlia?
anything.
Listen to
I
me.
didn't do anything.
You're going to
I didn't
jail.
do anything, please. I didn't do anything.
Tell me you didn't do anything.
I didn't do anything.
You're going to jail today. As soon as I'm done, they're going to come in here and handcuff you and take you to the Palm Beach County Jail, book you for solicitation of first-degree murder on your husband. Your husband is well and alive.
Thank God.
Oh, yeah, thank God.
Please? Can I see him?
No, he doesn't want to see you.
I so wanted to see him.
He doesn't want to see you.
Please?
After Dahlia was arrested, she was still sitting in that interrogation room when the Boynton Beach Police Department made a special point of walking Dahlia's husband, Michael, past the open door so she could see him. Here's her reaction.
Oh my God.
He's alive.
Come here, please. Come here. Mike, come here. Come here, please. Come here. Why not? I didn't do anything to you. Mike, come here, please. Come here.
Okay. Like, we'll take her back to booking, please.
Dahlia was initially sentenced to 20 years in prison for what she had done, but after a retrial because of jury bias, her sentence was reduced to 16 years. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please ask the like button if you can borrow their car for the week, and then spend that week driving around picking up as much roadkill as you possibly can and packing it into their trunk and into their back seat, and then return their car. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 1 or 2 video uploads. We now have a podcast called MrBallen Podcast, and we put out brand new, never before heard podcast exclusive episodes on Monday mornings. And then on Thursday mornings, we put out remastered audio from popular YouTube videos. Again, it's called MrBallen Podcast, and it's available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, basically anywhere you get your podcasts, you can find it there. We have 2 additional YouTube channels. One is called MrBallen Shorts, where we upload random short videos and lost episodes, and the other channel is called MrBallen en Español, and it's a Spanish language channel. We also have a Facebook page just called MrBallen that puts out near daily content. We also have a Snapchat channel called MrBallen that puts out content on Sundays. We also have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. And if you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, the podcast, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Today's story is wild. I mean, honestly, it doesn't even sound real, but we pulled the story directly from newspapers all around the world. So it definitely did happen. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please swap out the like button spray deodorant for extremely harmful pesticide. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. One evening in September of 1885, a young woman named Mary stepped out of the backseat of a carriage onto a dirt road in rural England. She had traveled 100 miles from London to the countryside because her husband's aunt had invited her to come visit. Standing on the dirt road, Mary looked up at the big country house. Then she grabbed her suitcase and walked up to the front door and knocked. Then, a moment later, the aunt's maid opened the door. She greeted Mary and took her suitcase and brought the suitcase to the guest room, while Mary headed straight down the hallway to her aunt's bedroom. When she got there, Mary gently knocked on the door and then opened it up. And when she looked inside, she saw the aunt lying in bed, and, the aunt looked up and saw Mary and she smiled, but she was very old and very frail, not doing too well physically, and, that's part of the reason Mary was here, to just kind of see her while she still could. But the aunt looked up and saw Mary and recognized her, and so she smiled, and Mary came in and sat down next to her, and for a couple of minutes, the two women just had some small talk. Mary talked about her journey from London to, the countryside where she was now, and, the aunt talked about what she was up to. It was all just kind of, pleasantries. But at some point, the aunt kind of stopped and looked up at Mary, and she had this obvious look of pity on her face. And Mary immediately picked up on it. She's kind of looking back at the aunt, wondering what's going on here. And then the aunt just says to Mary, "Really, how are you holding up?" And immediately, Mary, when she heard this, she felt this knot in her throat and she had to fight back tears. I mean, she knew exactly what the aunt was talking about. So even though Mary was a young woman, she was already a widow. Her husband had died in an accident about 2 years earlier, and it had sent Mary into this spiraling deep depression. I mean, she was still completely grieving the loss of her husband. He had been the love of her life. And, her extended family and her husband's extended family were all well aware of how badly Mary had been doing. And so they had been extending her invitations constantly to come visit and basically just not be alone. I mean, that was the reason really why her husband's aunt had invited her here, is because she knew Mary likely wasn't doing well. Now, to Mary, this was nice in a way. I mean, she felt very comforted by the family members, and it did seem like people genuinely cared about her. But at the same time, she started to get the impression from basically everybody in her and her husband's family that they kind of expected her to, grieve this loss, but ultimately move on. Like, find somebody else, basically. You're young, like, get remarried, start a new life. But to Mary, she just wanted to be like, no, I'm never gonna find anyone like my husband. He was the love of my life and no one will ever match him, ever. Like, I'm done. I probably will never get married again. Like, he was it for me. And so at that moment, Mary really just wanted to end this conversation with her husband's aunt. Like, she didn't want to get into how she was feeling about her husband because it was bad. She felt bad. But instead of saying that to her husband's aunt, she just said, "You know what? I'm okay. I'm just totally exhausted from travel and I'm gonna go to bed." The aunt nodded and told Mary that, we'll have plenty of time to visit tomorrow, so go get some sleep. And so the two women hugged. And then Mary got up, she left the bedroom, headed to the guest room, she found her suitcase, got on some pajamas, and then crawled into bed. But a few hours later, in the middle of the night, Mary suddenly bolted upright in her bed. She was sweating, she was shaking, she was totally disoriented. It took her a few minutes to even remember where she was. But then finally, when she did and she realized she was safe, she realized she had just had this awful, visceral nightmare that she really couldn't even make sense of. In this nightmare, she was looking out at this huge open field. It's nighttime, and there's nothing but this field. But off in the distance, there was this broken down small shed. It was just sitting there conspicuously right in the middle of this field. And even though Mary was terrified of the shed, she felt this overwhelming urge to go to the shed and investigate. And so it's like with every step as she walked through this field closer and closer to the shed, her fear was rising. And then finally, when she got close to the shed, she began to hear what sounded like somebody moaning inside of the structure. And so now she's really scared, but she keeps walking towards the shed. And then she's right outside. She can't see into the shed, but she can hear the moaning. And she sees her hand just come down and fling the door open, almost like she didn't want to, but her body's acting on autopilot. And then she looks into the shed, and there's this figure tucked into the corner, kind of in the shadows. And it's the thing making these moaning sounds. And it turns, and Mary sees it's this woman, this emaciated, destroyed-looking woman, but her face is the same face as Mary's dead husband. And as soon as she saw that, it jolted her awake. And so that's where she was, sitting in her bedroom, trying to make sense of what she had just seen. And so after 15 or 20 minutes of Mary trying and failing to fall back asleep because of this horrible nightmare, Mary finally says, you know what, I'm just gonna go outside, clear my head, go for a walk. I know it's the middle of the night, whatever. I'll bring some brandy along and sip that to calm my nerves and just kind of walk around until I'm calm, and then I'll go back to sleep. So she hopped out of bed, she grabbed her flask of brandy, grabbed her jacket, got her shoes on, and walked out the front door. Thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. Big life changes are often necessary to living a full and happy life, but when you're in those big changes, it can be very stressful. When I left the military back in 2017 and became a civilian again, I remember that transition being so stressful. Not only was I desperate to find a civilian job, which I didn't really understand, didn't really know how to look for a job, didn't really know what my skill sets would translate to, but also I was filled with this dread that like at any moment I was gonna make the wrong decision that would horribly impact me and my family. It was just terrible. But luckily, during this tumultuous time, I actually discovered therapy. Not because of my job search, but because I was dealing with some sort of deep-seated anger issues stemming from my time in the military. But while I was in therapy, I wound up finding that, talking to my therapist about my job hunt was really helpful. They sort of gave me additional perspective and sort of helped me, kind of think my way through this big transition that was happening in my life. And lo and behold, not long after beginning therapy, I found a career, and I also found peace in my life. So if you're in the middle of a big life change right now, or if maybe there's a big change coming up and you're stressing about it, consider trying therapy. And a great therapy option is BetterHelp. BetterHelp is an entirely online therapy platform, so it's extremely easy to access and not stressful at all to get started. All you have to do is fill out a quick questionnaire online, and then they will match you with a licensed therapist in as little as 2 days. Also, you can change your therapist at any time at no additional cost. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/MrBallen for 10% off your first month of therapy. Again, that's betterhelp.com/MrBallen for 10% off your first month of therapy. Okay, back to the story. About 15 minutes later, Mary was walking up a hill with the moonlight casting down on her. She was sipping her brandy as she went and was already beginning to calm down. Now, Mary was used to living in the city, in London, and so being out here in the countryside was so different. It was so beautiful and peaceful and spaced out that she had kind of just begun walking and not stopped. I mean, she originally thought she would just stay on the aunt's property, but already she was well beyond the property lines and was basically just out exploring in the middle of the night, and she was having a nice time. And so up the hill Mary goes. Now, remember, Mary has never been to this area. This is basically an all-new place. She has no idea what's over here. And she goes up this hill, she crests the top, and she gets a look at what's up there for the first time. And when she sees what's up there, she freezes. She's looking out at this huge field, basically in all directions. And in the center of this field, maybe a couple hundred yards away, is a single small structure, a broken down wooden shed that looks nearly identical to the shed she had just seen in her nightmare. And as soon as she saw that, she's terrified because she knows it's the same one or it's eerily similar. But worse than that, when she saw it, despite her own fears and trepidations about being up here, she felt herself moving towards the shed. It was like her body went into autopilot the same way it did in her dream. It was like she had to go to the shed, even though everything inside of her logically is saying, don't go. But into the field she goes. She deviates off the path and just starts walking towards the shed. Her heart is beating like mad. And as she's getting closer and closer, she even begins to hear moaning sounds coming from the shed. It's like she's living out the nightmare in real life. She can't make sense of it. She wants to go back the other way, but she can't stop herself. She's just going towards the shed. And then finally she reaches the shed, and now for sure she can hear moaning coming from in this building. And she sees her hand reach down, and she flings open the shed, and she looks in, and sure enough, there is this dark figure tucked in the corner, clearly moaning, like this is her nightmare in real life. But when the person inside the shed turned to look at Mary, it was a woman, but they didn't have her dead husband's face. Instead, it was a woman who practically looked like she was dead or close to death. She obviously needed help. Now, at this point, Mary was kind of relieved. I mean, this whole situation is terrifying, but she was expecting to, somehow see her dead husband's face on this person in the shed. And so when it wasn't, and it was just like a normal person, albeit in a very strange set of circumstances, it was a relief. But now Mary didn't know what to do. It's like she's standing there looking at this woman, having no idea what to do. She doesn't understand how she could have dreamed this and now basically lived it too. Like nothing's adding up. But again, it was like her body continued to operate in this autopilot mode. She suddenly had this really intense desire to go into the shed and help this woman. She didn't know who she was. This is a total stranger in the middle of a field in a shed who's moaning and looks terrible. She has no idea what's going on, but in she goes. And she sits down next to this woman who's now kind of eyeing Mary like, what are you doing in here with me? And Mary says to her like, hey, what's going on? How'd you get here? What's wrong? Like, what's happening? But the woman, it was clear she wanted to respond to Mary and, tell her what was going on, but, she was too weak. It was like she really was on death's door here. And Mary could clearly see that. Like, she didn't need to be told this woman is in a very bad way here. Now, Mary knew what needed to happen is this woman needs to get to a hospital. But they were nowhere near a hospital, and this woman clearly can't get up and walk. And Mary's thinking, I'm not strong enough to carry this woman to the hospital. Like, what am I gonna do? And, Mary's thinking, maybe if I just run and get help and they can come back here. But she's looking at this woman thinking, I don't know if she'll survive. She's probably gonna die soon. Like, this is gonna happen now. And so Mary, again, sort of in this weird autopilot mode, decides, you know what? I'm gonna stay right here with this woman. She can't even talk. She can't tell me what's going on, but I am gonna be here with her. I'm gonna be present with her. And if she dies, I'll be here to support her. And so Mary just made herself comfortable. She took her jacket off, she put it over this woman, and then she began letting this woman sip from her brandy flask to, maybe kind of ease the pain. And all night, the two women just kind of sat there and laid together. When the sun finally rose the next morning, Mary looked over at the woman and saw she was still alive. And in fact, if anything, she seemed like her condition had maybe improved slightly. She seemed maybe a little bit more comfortable. Maybe that was from all the brandy. Who knows? But the woman seemed like she had stabilized a little bit. Still couldn't talk or really tell Mary anything, but she seemed to be doing a little bit better. And so Mary's thinking, okay, the sun's up now. Now I can run out, get help, and get this woman the care that she needs. But before Mary could even do that, she began hearing a stomping sound somewhere outside of the shed. And she realized it was a horse approaching. And so Mary, she bolts out of the shed and she looks over towards the road, and there's a horse pulling a covered wagon going right by, and Mary screams and yells and says she needs help. And a man pops his head out of the wagon and says what's going on, and Mary runs over to him and explains this weird situation, how there's this strange woman over here and she's clearly dying, she needs our help. And the man agreed to help. And so he went with Mary to the shed, he picked the woman up, he put her inside of his wagon, and then the three of them together in this wagon drove to Mary's husband's aunt's house. When they got there, the man carried the strange woman inside of the aunt's house, and then Mary told the aunt's maid to go call for the town doctor, and so she said she would. And so at this point, Mary was actually completely relieved. I mean, this was kind of a wild, very unexpected night. I mean, she doesn't even know who this woman is, but she's definitely happy that she's getting, some level of care here. But Mary sort of felt like her role in this was kind of diminished now. She's gotten the woman here and she's feeling so tired and weak from being up all night. And so Mary decided she would just take a nap. I mean, she had been up all night with this woman. She was exhausted. So into her bedroom she went, she climbed into bed, but as she's laying there, she realized she wasn't just tired. She actually felt kind of sick, like ill. And over the next few hours, as she kind of tossed and turned in her bed, not really able to sleep, she would develop this horrible fever. And this fever would just get worse and worse and worse, and Mary would become bedridden, dealing with this mystery illness for weeks, just drifting in and out of consciousness the whole time. It was October by the time Mary's fever finally broke. And on the day that it did, when Mary opened her eyes in this bed, she was clear-headed for the first time. I mean, really, it had been a very rough stretch of a few weeks. And so she's looking around the room, kind of taking stock of her environment, and she sees there's this strange person sitting in a chair in the corner. And her immediate reaction is, oh, this must be like a nurse or a doctor or somebody here that's kind of overseeing me. Mary was aware she had been very sick for several weeks and there were people in and out of the room. But she looked back at this person and realized she actually knew who it was. It was the woman she had rescued from the shed on the night she got sick. It was that woman. But now she wasn't sickly and, dying. The woman looked completely healthy and happy, and she was smiling ear to ear at Mary. Like, this didn't make any sense. Like, what's going on here? And also, Mary just couldn't help but think, like, wait a minute, why is this woman still here? It has been weeks since I rescued her from the shed. Why is she still here? Like, nothing's adding up. But before Mary could ask any questions, this woman, who clearly was super excited to see that Mary was now fully awake and attentive, this woman just starts talking a mile a minute, like she had been waiting to dump all this information on Mary as soon as she was well. Like, clearly this woman has been waiting diligently for her chance to tell her story. And the story that she dumped on Mary at her first chance, like this day, was incredible. The woman told her that a couple of years earlier, she had boarded the ship in England that was bound for Brazil. But about 5 days into their journey, while they're out on the open sea, the ship caught fire. It was this horrible fire. Everyone's trying to evacuate. And this woman said she was in her bedroom, asleep. She didn't even know what was happening. And while she's laying there and the ship is catching fire and beginning to sink, this stranger comes barreling into the room, literally wakes her up, scoops her up, and takes her to the top deck and gets her into a lifeboat right as the ship sinks. I mean, this stranger completely saved this woman's life. And so this woman, the stranger who had saved her, and a handful of other lucky people who had made it onto this lifeboat, just began rowing in a single direction, hoping they'd find land. And luckily they did. They found this deserted island. And so they landed there. And for a year, this woman and the stranger and those few people subsisted on this island, barely clinging to life, praying for rescue. And amazingly, after a year of being shipwrecked, they flagged down a ship that did rescue them and brought them to England. However, when they actually got to England, things weren't that good. The stranger who had saved this woman had basically lost his mind from living on this island, not expecting to be rescued. Even though they got rescued, it was like he wasn't coherent anymore. He had lost it. Not to mention he was really ill from the way they were living on this island, scavenging things that weren't necessarily edible, but just to survive, they were eating whatever they could. I mean, it was a very rough lifestyle. And this man, he just hadn't really handled it well. And so he got thrown in a hospital and placed in a particular ward for people that were mentally unwell, and he was basically forgotten about. However, the woman would tell Mary that, when this happened, she felt awful because she felt like this stranger had saved her life and she kind of owed him a debt. And so she decided it would be her mission to find the stranger's family and let them know where he was. And so the woman said she did some research and she figured out where one of his relatives lived. It was really far away on the other side of England. And so she spent all her money, using every vehicle she possibly could, every ride she could take, getting as close to this location as she possibly could. And then when she ran out of money, she just kept on walking towards this destination. And she kept going until she literally ran out of food and water, but she wasn't quite there yet. She knew she was getting close, and she's just walking, and she's basically falling apart, so hell-bent on finding this family member for this stranger, but she can't quite make it. She can't quite get to the family member's house. And that's when she finds this shed out in the middle of the field where she just collapses, thinking, okay, this is where I'm gonna die. And so back in the guest room, Mary is listening to this woman tell this unbelievable story, and at some point the woman just kind of stops when she gets to the shed scene. And Mary's looking at her like, I don't really understand where you're going with this. I don't understand why you're here telling me this. And the woman, she just starts to laugh, like this joyous laughter, just nonstop laughter. And then she goes, don't you get it? And then seconds later, Mary hears footsteps, and a man walks into the bedroom. And it's Mary's husband. He was the stranger who rescued that woman. He didn't die in an accident 2 years ago like they thought. He was in a shipwreck, but he survived. He was the man who got thrown in the hospital and forgotten about. And it was this woman who was making the journey to his aunt's house to tell her that he was still alive. And it was only because Mary had that totally bizarre nightmare that sort of led her to that shed that she found this woman who would have died in that shed and never quite gotten to the aunt's house, and so never could have told the family, never could have told Mary that her husband's still alive. It was because of that dream that fate aligned, and now her husband was back. Mary and her husband's story wound up being published in newspapers all over the world. I mean, people really could not get enough of this story. But despite how far-reaching this story became, nobody was ever able to come up with a logical explanation for how so many coincidences and this crazy dream Mary had, how it all came together to reunite Mary and her husband. Behind every story we tell are real people. That's why we started the MrBallen Foundation, to support victims and families impacted by violent crime. To date, with your incredible help, we've been able to donate over $1.5 million to these people in need. If you're already a part of this movement, thank you so much. If you're interested in joining it and helping us help more people, click the link below. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. The final confession at the end of this video is genuinely horrifying. Viewer discretion is advised. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel because that's all we do, and we upload 3 or 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please secretly teach the like button's parrot to screech obscenities every time the like button is on a work call. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. On September 12, 1982, 2 off-duty Alaska police officers were off hunting in a very remote section of Alaska about 20 miles away from Anchorage. The only way to get out to this area was by plane or by boat, and so generally speaking, the only people that came into this area were big-time hunters. After a long day, the 2 men realized it was starting to get dark and they were still deep in the woods, and so they decided it was time to turn around and start heading back to camp. The journey through the woods was challenging, and so the men walked down to the nearby Kinnick River and walked across an exposed sandbar. And as they walked, they noticed up ahead there was a boot sticking out of the sand. And as they got closer, they realized it wasn't just a boot, there was also a human leg bone still in the boot. Being police officers, they knew the importance of not disturbing a potential crime scene, and so instead they marked on the map where they were, they left the area, and they reported the body to their department. The following day, crime scene technicians came out to that remote area and they very carefully unearthed the remains, which still had women's clothing on them. And then afterwards, they began searching for evidence in the area, and eventually they discovered a single shell casing that was a .223 caliber round, which is a common caliber for hunting rifles. The remains were sent back to the lab for an autopsy, and it was revealed this person was a female and she had most likely died at least 6 months earlier. And she had almost certainly been the victim of a homicide because she had died from 3 gunshot wounds. Also during the autopsy, it was discovered that there were no bullet holes on any of her clothing, and so it appeared that she had been shot without her clothes on, and then her killer presumably redressed her. Also, they found a hospital bandage wrapped up in her clothing that appeared to have been wrapped around her head, leading some to speculate that she had been blindfolded before she was shot. A couple of weeks after the autopsy, dental records came back and they identified the body as belonging to 23-year-old Sherry Morrow. Sherry was an exotic dancer from Anchorage who had been reported missing 10 months earlier. In her missing persons report, it was stated that the last thing she told her friends was she had been offered $300 to have pictures taken of her by a professional photographer, and she was going to meet this man right before she disappeared. While police were fairly certain that Sherry's killer was this so-called photographer, they had no evidence that would allow them to search for this person. They had nothing. All they had was this shell casing that was commonly used amongst hunters. And there's lots of hunters in Alaska. So the police reported the finding of Sherry's body to the media in hopes that when they put that out to the world, that someone from the public would reach out with more information. During the police's press conference, one of the reporters asked them, do you think Sherry's death is connected to the other unsolved deaths in that part of Alaska? What they were referencing was 2 years earlier, 2 other women's bodies had been discovered in that rough area where Sherry had been found. One of the women was so badly decomposed there was no way to identify her. However, it was revealed she was probably in her late teens or early 20s. The other woman was able to be identified. It was 24-year-old Joanne Messina, who was an exotic dancer from Anchorage. But there was virtually no evidence at either of the 2 women's grave sites, and so their deaths remained a mystery. Publicly, at this press conference, the police told reporters that they did not believe Sherry's death was connected to those 2 other women. But privately, some officers had their suspicions. Not only had these 3 women met similar fates in a similar area, but over the past couple of years, there had been a significant increase in missing people out of Anchorage, Alaska. And most of these missing people were young women that were either exotic dancers or prostitutes. This convinced many officers that they were dealing with a serial killer, but there just wasn't any evidence to actually prove it, so they couldn't come out and say it publicly. Over the following year, no new information came out about Sherry Morrow or the other 2 deceased women that had been found in that same area, and so all 3 of their cases just continued continued to languish. Meanwhile, more and more exotic dancers and prostitutes were going missing out of Anchorage, and no one knew why. Then, on June 13th, 1983, the police got a break. Early that morning, a man driving a truck turned onto a quiet Anchorage highway, and as he was making his way down the road, he saw up ahead on the side, there was this woman running towards him, screaming with her hands over her head, and she wasn't wearing pants or shoes. And so obviously he knew something was wrong, and so he pulled over, and as this woman is charging up towards him, he notices she has a handcuff on one of her wrists, and she appears to be a lot younger than he initially thought. She's probably in her late teens. And so she comes running up to his car, he unlocks the passenger side door, she flings herself inside without even... The final confession at the end of this video is genuinely horrifying. Viewer discretion is advised. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel because that's all we do, and we upload 3 or 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please secretly teach the like button's parrot to screech obscenities every time the like button is on a work call. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. On September 12, 1982, 2 off-duty Alaska police officers were off hunting in a very remote section of Alaska about 20 miles away from Anchorage. The only way to get out to this area was by plane or by boat, and so generally speaking, the only people that came into this area were big-time hunters. After a long day, the 2 men realized it was starting to get dark and they were still deep in the woods, and so they decided it was time to turn around and start heading back to camp. The journey through the woods was challenging, and so the men walked down to the nearby Kinnick River and walked across an exposed sandbar. And as they walked, they noticed up ahead there was a boot sticking out of the sand. And as they got closer, they realized it wasn't just a boot, there was also a human leg bone still in the boot. Being police officers, they knew the importance of not disturbing a potential crime scene, and so instead they marked on the map where they were, they left the area, and they reported the body to their department. The following day, crime scene technicians came out to that remote area and they very carefully unearthed the remains, which still had women's clothing on them. And then afterwards, they began searching for evidence in the area, and eventually they discovered a single shell casing that was a .223 caliber round, which is a common caliber for hunting rifles. The remains were sent back to the lab for an autopsy, and it was revealed this person was a female and she had most likely died at least 6 months earlier. And she had almost certainly been the victim of a homicide because she had died from 3 gunshot wounds. Also during the autopsy, it was discovered that there were no bullet holes on any of her clothing, and so it appeared that she had been shot without her clothes on, and then her killer presumably redressed her. Also, they found a hospital bandage wrapped up in her clothing that appeared to have been wrapped around her head, leading some to speculate that she had been blindfolded before she was shot. A couple of weeks after the autopsy, dental records came back and they identified the body as belonging to 23-year-old Sherry Morrow. Sherry was an exotic dancer from Anchorage who had been reported missing 10 months earlier. In her missing persons report, it was stated that the last thing she told her friends was she had been offered $300 to have pictures taken of her by a professional photographer, and she was going to meet this man right before she disappeared. While police were fairly certain that Sherry's killer was this so-called photographer, they had no evidence that would allow them to search for this person. They had nothing. All they had was this shell casing that was commonly used amongst hunters. And there's lots of hunters in Alaska. So the police reported the finding of Sherry's body to the media in hopes that when they put that out to the world, that someone from the public would reach out with more information. During the police's press conference, one of the reporters asked them, do you think Sherry's death is connected to the other unsolved deaths in that part of Alaska? What they were referencing was 2 years earlier, 2 other women's bodies had been discovered in that rough area where Sherry had been found. One of the women was so badly decomposed there was no way to identify her. However, it was revealed she was probably in her late teens or early 20s. The other woman was able to be identified. It was 24-year-old Joanne Messina, who was an exotic dancer from Anchorage. But there was virtually no evidence at either of the 2 women's grave sites, and so their deaths remained a mystery. Publicly, at this press conference, the police told reporters that they did not believe Sherry's death was connected to those 2 other women. But privately, some officers had their suspicions. Not only had these 3 women met similar fates in a similar area, But over the past couple of years, there had been a significant increase in missing people out of Anchorage, Alaska. And most of these missing people were young women that were either exotic dancers or prostitutes. This convinced many officers that they were dealing with a serial killer, but there just wasn't any evidence to actually prove it, so they couldn't come out and say it publicly. Over the following year, no new information came out about Sherry Morrow or the other 2 deceased women that had been found in that same area, and so all 3 of their cases just continued to languish. Meanwhile, more and more exotic dancers and prostitutes were going missing out of Anchorage, and no one knew why. Then, on June 13th, 1983, the police got a break. Early that morning, a man driving a truck turned onto a quiet Anchorage highway, and as he was making his way down the road, he saw up ahead on the side, there was this woman running towards him, screaming with her hands over her head, and she wasn't wearing pants or shoes. And so obviously he knew something was wrong, and so he pulled over, and as this woman is charging up towards him, he notices she has a handcuff on one of her wrists, and she appears to be a lot younger than he initially thought. She's probably in her late teens. And so she comes running up to his car, he unlocks the passenger side door, she flings herself inside without even asking for permission, she slams the door behind her, and then ducks down to keep her head out of the window, like she's trying to hide from something out there. Now this man looked out and he didn't see anyone or anything, but he wasn't going to wait around for whatever it was she was scared of, and so he just made a gut decision to take this girl away from here. And so he peeled off and drove down the road, and the girl, who was very shaken up, couldn't even tell this guy what was going on. She just asked him to please drop her off at a nearby motel, and the man didn't ask any questions. He drove her to the motel and he dropped her off. The girl ran inside and up to her room, and when she ran inside, the motel receptionist sees this girl running in. I mean, she doesn't have her pants on, she's got a handcuff on, she looks terrified, and so she called the police. A few minutes later, the police showed up. They went up to this girl's room, they knocked on the door. The girl opened it up and she was obviously very scared, and she allowed the police inside, and she told them her name was Cindy Paulson and she was 17 years old. The police recognized this girl is terrified, she's not a threat, and so they removed the one handcuff that was still on her, and then they asked her, what happened? And the police officers would say her story was just horrible. But what stood out to them was not how disturbing the story was, it was how composed and brave this girl was as she told it. This is her story. The night before, Cindy was working the streets of Anchorage. She was a prostitute, and a car pulled up, and inside was this wiry, bearded guy with glasses who seemed kind of slight and harmless, and he asked to buy her services. And because she didn't view him as a threat, she agreed and hopped in his passenger seat, and as soon as she sat down, he reached over and put a handcuff on one wrist, and then drew a gun on her and told her to be quiet. And then he drove her to this fairly nice neighborhood, pulled into a driveway, he got her out of the car and led her into this house, and he brought her along downstairs into the basement, where as soon as she got down there was a dim light, and she saw there was a chain swinging from the ceiling. And he strung her up onto that chain, and for hours he assaulted her. And then after he grew tired of doing that, he told her he was going to go take a nap, and when he came back, they were going to leave this house and go out to his cabin in the woods. At this point, she begged him to let her go, but he really didn't care. He just told her that if she made any noise or tried to escape at any point, he would have to kill her. And then he walked out of the room. And for the next several hours, Cindy remained chained to the ceiling with half of her clothes off, wondering what horrible thing was going to happen to her next. Eventually, her attacker came back in the room, and he untied her from her chain, and he walked her upstairs to his living room, where he very proudly showed her a number of hunting trophies he had, and he began telling her about how much he loved hunting and where he went hunting. And it was at this point that Cindy realized this guy has no intention of keeping her alive. He's shown her his face, his house, his car. He's told her about places he likes to go and things he likes to do. He's given her all this information about himself. She is a huge liability to him. And so it dawned on her that if she didn't find a way to escape, she was going to die. After the trophy tour, the man led Cindy back out to her car, he put her inside, and then he drove to a nearby small airport where he said his plane was. And so he pulled over to their hangar, he got her out of the car, and he put her inside of the plane. And as Cindy is sitting in the plane, she's watching this guy load gun after gun and bag after bag of what looks like military supplies into this plane. And so she knows that this is the moment. I have to escape right now, because as soon as this plane takes off, I'm done for. And so at some point when this guy went over to his car to get something and his back was turned to her, she jumped out of the cockpit of this plane. She fell to the ground. She got up and just began running out of the hangar. And she managed to get out of the hangar and began turning the corner and running towards this forest right as she hears this guy charging after her, screaming that he's going to catch her and kill her. And so she just keeps running for her life all the way into this forest, all the way to that highway, before she finally stopped and turned around and she saw the man had stopped following her. This is when she went onto the highway and she flagged down the guy in the truck who brought her to the motel. The police were shocked by her story. It sounded totally unbelievable, but she was so genuinely scared and so detailed that they believed her. And so they told her they would have to bring her to the hospital, and on their way to the hospital, she demanded they go back to that airport that she had been held at so she can try to identify the hangar she had been in, and hopefully the plane would still be in there. And so the police comply, they go into the airport, and Cindy points out the hangar she believes she was in. And when they get there, the plane she had been on was still there, but the man, her attacker, was not there. And so the police got out and they began taking down notes about the plane, its different tag numbers and what it looked like. And while they're standing there, the security guard from the airport came over because he saw the police cars, and he told the officers that the night before he had seen the owner of the plane they're looking at acting very suspiciously with something inside of his car. And so on a hunch, he had recorded that man's license plate number, and he gave that number to police. And so the police were able to use that license plate number and some of the numbers on the plane to figure out who owned both vehicles. And it was a local man named Robert Hansen who owned a very successful bakery downtown. After dropping Cindy off at the hospital, the police officers decided to pay a visit to Robert Hansen at his house. When they got there, Robert was actually pulling into his driveway right at the same time, and they saw his car matched the description that Cindy had given of his car. And then when Robert got out of his car, he matched the description that Cindy had given of her attacker. When Robert saw the police parked outside of his house, he immediately invited them over and said, what can I help you with? And the police said, we'd like to talk to you. Can we go inside? Robert invited them inside, and when the police went into his house, it matched the description that Cindy had given of his house with all the hunting trophies everywhere. And so they sat down and they asked him what he was doing the night before, and he said he had spent the night with some friends, and he had their contact information, and if you needed to talk to them, you could, but they would say he was with them. When the police asked if they could have a look around his property, Robert immediately consented and said, you can look anywhere you want. And so the police searched his property, but found no signs that Cindy had been attacked there. And so they thanked him for his hospitality and they left. Once they got back to their station, they checked in with Robert's two friends he claimed he was with the night before, and they each independently corroborated Robert's story, saying that yes, he was with them from this time to this time. And so it appeared, as unlikely as it seemed, that Robert was telling the truth. And so the police went back to Cindy and they said, are you sure that everything you told us is exactly as you remember it? You didn't exaggerate anything? This is the truth? And Cindy said, absolutely. And they said, okay, well, are you prepared to take a lie detector test to prove that you're telling the truth? And Cindy said, no. Now, it's unclear why she said no. Maybe it was a general distrust of the police, but either way, when she said no, it immediately cast an enormous amount of doubt on her story in the eyes of the police. And when Cindy started to pick up that the police really didn't believe her anymore, she got spooked and just left town. And after that, her case and Robert Hansen were largely forgotten about. But 3 months later, on September 2nd, all of that changed. On that day, a construction crew was doing some work on a backcountry road not far from where those 3 women's bodies had been found. And at some point, one of their machines uncovered some human remains. The police were called in, who pulled up the rest of the remains, and then just like in Sherry Morrow's case, when they looked for evidence around this new body, they found a single shell casing from a .223 caliber round. The remains were brought back for an autopsy, where it was determined that the body was female and she had died from several gunshot wounds. Using dental records, they were able to identify this woman as being 17-year-old Paula Goulding, who was an exotic dancer who had gone missing 5 months prior from Anchorage. The police sent the .223 shell casing found in Paula's gravesite, along with the other .223 shell casing found in Sherry Morrow's gravesite, to a lab to be analyzed. And it was quickly determined that both of these rounds had been fired from the same rifle, and therefore both women had most likely been killed by the same person. This was the moment the police knew they were dealing with a serial killer, and many police officers wanted it to be Robert Hansen. He seemed like the guy, but he had a rock-solid alibi and they had no hard evidence against him. And so without any other suspects, the police turned to a famous FBI profiler, a guy by the name of John Douglas, and they asked him to build a profile of who he think killed Sherry Morrow and Paula Goulding. And when John's report came back, the police were shocked. The profile described a man in his 40s who blended in easily with society. He was well-liked and got along with people, and was just a normal guy. And he was successful, probably because he owned a successful business. He was an avid outdoorsman and hunter, and he most likely had a significant speech defect, like a lisp or a stutter. The profile was perfectly describing Robert Hansen. And because of John Douglas's prolific success in correctly identifying killers based on his profiles, when a judge saw this particular profile and saw how neatly it lined up with Robert Hansen, he gave the FBI a search warrant for Robert's house. And this time they would find very damning evidence, like a map of the local area. It was a hunting map, and on it there were 37 X's marked off. And some of those X's coincided with the same area where those 4 women's bodies had been found. They also found a .223 caliber rifle, along with a bag of women's jewelry that contained a necklace belonging to Sherry Morrow. As the FBI was carrying evidence out of Robert's house into their truck, a neighbor walked over after seeing all the commotion, and she walked up to one of the agents, and she was very skittish and anxious, and she said, my husband, he's friends with Robert, and he recently pretended to be an alibi for Robert. He had no idea how much trouble he was in, and I certainly didn't know, but I want you guys to know that my husband was lying. He was not with Robert on the night that he said he was. This was the proverbial nail in the coffin for Robert Hansen, because now, without this alibi, he had nothing to hide behind. And so when the police approached Robert with their overwhelming evidence against him between what they found in his house and this now recanted statement from his former alibi, Robert said, okay, I'm going to confess. But there was a catch. In 2015, a startling discovery was made inside of this off-limits area inside of a prominent South African hospital. Now, at the time, no one really understood what this discovery meant, and so eventually people just kind of forgot about it and moved on. Until 2 years later, when another eerily similar discovery was made inside of another prominent South African hospital in one of their off-limits areas. I can't believe this story has not gotten more press because 1, it's recent, and 2, the implications of these discoveries are mind-boggling. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please put coyote urine in the like button's apple juice. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On October 4th, 2017, a 61-year-old father of 6 named Tatike Katsai arrived at a hospital in Stellenbosch, which is one of the richest towns in South Africa. Tatike, who lived in the area with his family, had been dealing with some stomach issues over the last several months, and so this day he was finally going in to have abdominal surgery to hopefully alleviate those issues. So, after entering the building, Tatike was checked in, and then before long he was transferred to the operating room where surgeons got to work on him. After the surgery was over, Tatike was transferred to a recovery room in the hospital where he was scheduled to stay for at least a couple of days so the doctors and nurses could watch over him while he recovered and make sure there was no complications from the procedure. And so, on the afternoon of October 4th, Tatike just kind of lounged around inside of his recovery room. He couldn't really do anything because of the incisions on his stomach, and so he mostly just laid in his bed, he watched TV, he relaxed, he ate, and then at some point, some of his family members came into the hospital and they visited with him as well. By the end of that day, the day of his surgery, Tatike was definitely sore from the incisions, but overall, he was in good spirits, and to the medical staff, it seemed very likely that his surgery was a success. Early the next morning, at around 5:15 a.m., one of the nurses in the hospital went to Tatike's room to check on him. And when she went inside, Tatike was awake, he was alert, he seemed totally normal. And so after a brief conversation, the nurse told Tatike that she was just going to get him some fresh linens to make up his bed. And so Tatike nodded a thank you to her, and then the nurse, she turned away from Tatike, who's in his bed. She stepped out of the one door in the room into the hallway. She grabbed fresh linens linens off of a cart, and then she turned back around and went back into Tatike's room, except now Tatike was not in his bed. So the nurse immediately thought, okay, well then Tatike must have gone into his bathroom because the door was shut. He must be in the bathroom. And so just kind of reflexively, the nurse walked over to Tatike's now empty bed and replaced the linens. And then when she was done, she just looked at the bathroom door inside of his room, expecting Tatike to come outside any minute. But after a couple of minutes passed and Tatike had still not come out of the bathroom, the nurse decided to go over and just knock. And so she walked over, she knocked on the bathroom door and just kind of called out, hey, is everything okay in there? But there was no answer. And so the nurse eventually just tried the handle, and when she saw it was open, she called out that she was coming inside. She opened up the bathroom door, and it was empty. And so the nurse, she whipped her head around and looked back out at the room where Tatike should have been, and she saw, he's not on the bed, he's not under the bed, he's not anywhere in this room. Where could he have possibly gone? And she's thinking to herself, the only door out of this room is into the hallway, the same door that she had used to go out and get the linens. And if somehow Tatike had ran out of that door in the few seconds that her back was turned from Tatike, she certainly would have heard him or seen him. Because again, she was right outside the door and only outside of his room for a couple of seconds. Not to mention the fact Tatike has major incisions on his stomach and could barely stand, let alone walk or run. And so totally baffled, this nurse ultimately left the room and went and told her superiors. Thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. In 2017, I left the military and pretty much right away, I fell apart. The military had provided a lot of structure in my life, and so suddenly not having that structure made me feel like I was lost. Pretty soon, I began resenting all the people around me just because they seemed happy and I wasn't. I sort of figured that these feelings of resentment and unhappiness would just kind of go away on their own, but they didn't. Eventually, with some encouragement from my family and my friends, I sought out a therapist. And quickly, my therapist diagnosed me with depression, something I really did not think I was. But after the shock of the diagnosis had worn off, me and my therapist were able to kind of go back in my life and figure out what was causing me to feel the way I was feeling. And before long, having that perspective really made me feel a lot better. Look, therapy is not for everyone, but it is a great starting point for people who just kind of feel lost and don't really know where to go. And so if that's you, I would highly suggest you give BetterHelp a try. BetterHelp is the world's largest therapy service, and it's 100% online. Get matched with a therapist after filling out a brief survey, and then you can communicate with your therapist however you feel comfortable, whether that's text messaging, phone call, video call, chat, whatever you want. You can also switch therapists at any time for free. Get 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/MrBallen. I've also linked them in the description below. This hospital would immediately begin looking for Tatike on the grounds of the hospital, but they would do it kind of quietly. They wouldn't call Tatike's family to tell them that, hey, we can't find him, nor would they call police. And some have speculated that either one, the hospital did not think this was an emergency and they would quickly find Tatike and that everything would be fine, or two, the hospital was just so embarrassed at the idea that they lost a patient, they didn't want anyone to know, and so that's why they didn't tell anyone. Regardless, the hospital would search for Tatike all day on the 5th, the day he went missing, and they wouldn't find him. And then the next day, the 6th, the hospital again would spend the entire day quietly searching everywhere in the hospital, but they wouldn't find him again. And so finally on the next day, the 7th, so 48 hours after Tatike had just kind of vanished inside of his room, the hospital would reach out to Tatike's family and they would say to them, hey, is Tatike home with you guys? And the family was like, no, he's supposed to be with you. And so the hospital would say, well, he left 2 days ago, so we don't know where he is. And so Tatike's family is horrified, not only that they were totally left in the dark, but they would find out over the course of this conversation that the hospital had not even contacted the police yet. And so the family, they reached out to the police, and then later that day, the family would meet the police at the Stellenbosch hospital, and then a very public search of the property would ensue to look for Tatike. However, again, no one could find him. Authorities would continue to search both the hospital and also the neighboring area outside of the hospital over the next couple of days, but after they continued to find absolutely nothing, the search began to wind down. And so Tatike's devastated family was left with absolutely no idea what to think or what to do. Fast forward to October 20th, so 15 days after Tatike had gone missing. And on this day, the 20th, there was a construction crew at this hospital in Stellenbosch doing some renovations. And at some point on this day, one of the workers had to climb into the ceiling of one of the floors of this hospital. Now, the space above the ceiling is this tight, cramped space, almost like an attic. It's very big and wide. It's like the whole length of that floor. And really the only people that would ever go into the ceiling are construction workers or other authorized personnel that needed to do work. It's not a place that the public would ever go into. But when one of these workers went up into the ceiling, he had a headlamp on and he's kind of looking around, he's looking for what he needs to do up there, and at some point he turns his head and his light illuminates a person sitting in the corner far away from him, way up against the side in this tiny little attic space. And it would turn out it was Tatike, and he was deceased. The hospital had absolutely no clue how Tatike could have gotten up there. Not only is it obviously not a publicly accessible area, but the actual way to get up into the ceiling, the door that leads up into the ceiling, is very difficult to find. And even if Tatike found this entrance into the ceiling, it would have been nearly impossible for him to actually get into the ceiling. Because again, this guy has serious incisions on his stomach from the surgery he got. He could barely sit up, he couldn't really walk, so the idea of him climbing and pulling himself up into the ceiling just seems impossible. Then there was the very strange autopsy results. Now, the full report has not been made public, but Tatike's family had a consultation with the hospital after the autopsy was complete, and they would go to reporters and talk about what the hospital told them. And apparently, the hospital told the family that Tatike did not die from complications from his surgery, and they heavily insinuated that Tatike did not die from natural causes. Something happened to him, and the hospital had no idea what this something was, and that's what killed him. And the hospital also told the family that Tatike likely was dead before he went up into the ceiling. Meaning someone or something killed Tatike, and then someone or something placed him in the ceiling. Again, this is just from the family going to reporters and talking about their discussion with the hospital. The hospital's only official statement has basically been that they have cooperated with the family and they don't really know what happened to Tatike. Now, of course, this is a very strange story, but it gets even weirder. On May 10th, 2019, so about a year and a half after Tatike was found deceased in the Stellenbosch hospital ceiling, a 53-year-old father of 4 named Sandile Sabia arrived at another hospital in South Africa. It was in a city called Durban, which is considered to be one of the nicest and wealthiest places in South Africa, similar to Stellenbosch. Sandile was a builder, and he had been working on a house when he had fallen and broken his leg. Specifically, he broke his femur bone, the bone that runs from your hip down to your knee, the big single bone in your thigh. So just for reference, if you break your femur, you can't walk. So, with some assistance from friends and family, Sandile hobbled his way into this hospital in Durban, and he began to receive care. 2 days later, on May 17th, Sandile was still in the hospital, still recovering from this broken femur, when his cousin came to visit him. The cousin said Sandile seemed totally normal, and that during this visit, Sandile told the cousin that after the cousin left, Sandile was going to be transported from this hospital to another hospital nearby, where he was going to get an x-ray of his leg, as well as talk to another orthopedic surgeon. But apparently, after this cousin left from this visit, the doctors at the Durban hospital walked into Sandile's room to take him and transport him to this other hospital, and Sandile was not in his room. Now, this hospital in Durban was known for their very tight security, and so right away, their reaction was very different than the Stellenbosch hospital's reaction. This hospital immediately contacted authorities and said, "We are missing a patient," and they began a very public search of their hospital for Sandile. But They couldn't find him. On May 18th, so 6 days after Sandil disappeared, the hospital in Durban began to smell this horrible stench coming from one wing of their hospital. And so hospital workers would track the stench to a janitor's closet, and when they opened it up, they saw this black liquid dripping out of the ceiling, and the liquid was coming from Sandil's decomposing body that was located in the ceiling. Sandil's autopsy would be carried out very quickly. However, the results of that autopsy have never been made public, and Sandil's family has not commented on the results of this autopsy. As of today, all we know is that within a 2-year period, 2 seemingly ordinary South African men, who both could either not walk at all or who could barely walk because of their physical injuries, somehow snuck out of their hospital rooms totally undetected by staff and then wound up dead in the hospital ceiling. Some say the men really did somehow sneak out of their own accord and decided to go into the ceiling, and that's what happened. Others say both men were murdered and then placed into the ceiling, and still others think these 2 cases are the best examples of something called spontaneous teleportation, which is the hypothetical phenomenon where a human suddenly disappears and then almost instantaneously reappears in another location. But for now, there is no official explanation, so those are all just theories. And so it's up to you to decide what you believe. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's story and you haven't done this already, please put coyote urine in the like button's apple juice. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. We have a podcast called the MrBallen Podcast that puts out brand new podcast exclusive stories on Monday mornings, and on Thursday mornings, we upload remastered audio of our best YouTube videos. Again, it's called the MrBallen Podcast, and it is available exclusively on Amazon Music. Consider donating to our charity called the MrBallen Foundation. It provides support to victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to mrballen.foundation and click on Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. We have 2 additional YouTube channels. One is called MrBallen Shorts. The other is called MrBallen en Espanol. We post near daily content on Facebook, Snapchat, and TikTok. All of those pages are just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Check out our merch at shopmrballen.com, and if you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, the podcast, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Sometimes, everyday people are forced to make truly unthinkable decisions. Take, for example, somebody who goes to work like normal, and then a fire breaks out in their office, they can't get rescued, and suddenly this person is deciding whether they want to burn to death or jump out the window to their death. Now, when we hear about these totally tragic stories, we all wonder the same thing. What would we do in that situation? Well, I want you to keep that question in the back of your mind as you listen to today's story, because it's about these 2 people who find themselves in a totally hopeless situation. And so as it unfolds, ask yourself, what would you do? But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, after the like button has gone to bed for the night, secretly sneak into their room and slightly unplug their phone charger from their phone so it looks like it's plugged in, but it's not charging. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. At about 1:30 in the afternoon on August 8th, 1999, a park ranger named Lance Madsen stood frowning down at a dusty red Mazda car inside of an otherwise empty parking lot just outside of Carlsbad Caverns National Park in New Mexico. Lance knew the two men who owned this red Mazda had taken out a one-night permit to be allowed to go into Rattlesnake Canyon, which is one of the most isolated parts of this national park. It's basically just a single long scrubby little trail that's kind of all desert with high canyon walls on either side. In order to get access to Rattlesnake Canyon, people need to go to the visitor center and literally fill out paperwork so the park rangers know they're out there and can go out and check on them if they don't come back in time. And so the two men who owned the Mazda had done that. They had filled out all the paperwork, but now Lance was noticing they had not returned at the end of their permit. They had stayed out, presumably in Rattlesnake Canyon, for an additional 3 nights. Now, Lance was not concerned because people did do this. It was more like he was annoyed because now he would have to go out into Rattlesnake Canyon and find these two guys and figure out what was going on. So Lance and the park volunteer that he was with began walking on the trail in the direction of Rattlesnake Canyon. And after walking less than a mile on this trail, Lance and this volunteer looked up ahead, and just off the trail, there was a green and maroon tent that was pitched right out in the open. And so Lance immediately assumed that this had to be the two men who owned the red Mazda. And so very quickly, Lance's annoyance was replaced with relief, because it turned out it was really easy to find these two campers, and he'd be able to go figure out what was going on and either get them back to their car and get them to leave, or if they wanted to, they could, in theory, extend and stay longer with the right permitting. But when Lance and his partner walked down the trail and left the trail to go walk over to this tent, they started to notice there was something off about it. Right away, as they got closer and closer to this tent, they began to smell this horrible kind of chemical burning smell, and then also all over the ground were all these little bits of burned pieces of trash. And then finally, when Lance and his partner actually arrived right in front of the tent, and they were looking down at the closed flap, it was zipped shut, they saw clearly there was something moving around inside of the tent. But whoever or whatever it was wasn't making any noise. And so Lance and his partner, they kind of looked at each other, and they both at this point were pretty nervous. You know, their hearts are racing. They don't know what's going on here. And then Lance just kind of impulsively reached down, unzipped the tent, and lifted it open. And when he saw what was inside, he immediately was hit with this wave of fear and anxiety. 3 days earlier, on August 5th, 1999, a 26-year-old man named David Coughlin woke up in a sleeping bag inside of his green and maroon tent in Rattlesnake Canyon. And as soon as David sat up, he smiled because he could hear right outside of his tent the sound of his best friend, Rafi Kodakian, making breakfast and gathering up supplies for that morning's hike. Dave and Rafi were on what they called a trip of a lifetime. 6 days earlier, they had left their hometown of Boston, Massachusetts, and traveled more than 2,000 miles west, sleeping at campsites and cheap motels along the way. Their final destination was a university in Santa Barbara, California, where Dave was going to be getting his master's in environmental engineering, but they were going to basically turn the journey out to California into a big vacation. And Carlsbad Caverns National Park was easily both of the men's favorite spots so far, because unlike the other campgrounds they had stayed at so far, which were kind of cheap and small, Carlsbad Caverns was huge. It was 47,000 acres of just wild desert. And so for Dave and Rafi, whose normal everyday lives were kind of safe and boring, doing desk jobs and the like, this felt sort of thrilling, like they were cowboys exploring the Wild West. As Dave sat inside of his tent, listening to Rafi make breakfast and get ready, Dave noticed he was already sweating, despite it being pretty early in the morning. It was just already so hot outside. And so Dave grabbed his water and took a sip, and as he did, he thought about that park ranger who had helped them fill out their paperwork to be allowed to come out into Rattlesnake Canyon, who had made a really big deal about ensuring that Dave and Rafi each have at least 1 gallon of water per person per day that they were going to be out here because of the heat. But after they had left the park ranger, Rafi, who had way more experience camping than Dave did, explained to Dave that that was totally overkill and they didn't need that much water. So instead of bringing 2 huge gallons of water for the single night they planned to be out in Rattlesnake Canyon, Rafi had brought along for both of them just 3 16-ounce bottles of water. For reference, that's approximately 6 times less than what the park ranger had suggested. The men had already used one of those 16-ounce bottles of water to boil hot dogs the night before for their dinner, and now the bottle that Dave was drinking from was already half empty, and so he was pretty much down to the last of his water. But Dave wasn't really worried about his water because he and Raffi were going to be hiking out of Rattlesnake Canyon that day and heading back to their car and continuing their journey out to California. And they knew they had set up their tent very close to the parking lot. And so it was a short hike, they're back in their car, and then they're good. And so Dave capped his water, he got out of his sleeping bag, he left the tent, and he joined Raffi in prepping their supplies to get ready for their hike out. And by 8:30 a.m., their entire site was packed up, and the two men were on their way heading back. The two men walked at a leisurely pace in the direction towards their vehicle for about an hour, and as they walked, they did see signs that they were on the right trail. There were these stacks of white rocks that marked the trail. But after walking this full hour, they knew they probably should have been at the parking lot, but they didn't see it yet. However, the two men were not worried yet because remember, they know they're close, and so they're thinking, okay, maybe a couple more minutes and we'll see the parking lot. And so they stopped, they had some more water, and then they kept on walking. But after walking for another 2-3 hours, still in the direction that they believe was towards the parking lot, they did not see the parking lot. In fact, they didn't see anything that looked familiar, and there were no more stacks of white rocks to show they were even on a trail. They were totally lost. And so Dave and Raffi, who were doing their best not to panic, they both sat down, they pulled off their packs, and they pulled out their topographical map and began looking for some sign of where they were. But neither man could read the topographical map, and so all the swirls on the map showing every contour of every geographical feature, it just didn't make any sense to them, and so the map was of no use, and it was getting hotter and hotter by the minute. And so Dave and Raffi put the map away, feeling totally frustrated, and for a second they thought about getting up and just continuing to walk roughly in the direction they thought they should go. But as soon as they stood up, they both just felt so exhausted from walking and the heat, which was now, it's noon, so it's really burning down on them. And so the two men just walked over to the edge of a canyon wall where some shrubs were kind of hanging off the wall, providing a little bit of shade. And the two men just plunked down right underneath the shade, and they just sat there in silence. Both men knew they did not have the supplies to stay out in this canyon for much longer. They certainly didn't have enough water, which now really was starting to feel like a huge oversight. But luckily, as they're just sitting there, these huge storm clouds rolled in, and for a very short amount of time, there was this incredible downpour of rain. And so Dave and Raffi began catching the raindrops in their mouths, and they began drinking the water off of rocks and leaves. And it wasn't a lot, but it was enough to kind of boost their spirits. They got a little bit more hydration in, and they were kind of ready to deal with the problem they were facing. After the storm had gone, Dave and Raffi decided that their best move was just to continue walking and try to find this parking lot. But despite this motivation, Dave and Raffi would walk for hours and hours into the night. They would not find the parking lot, and so finally they realized they would have to stop and set up camp for another night. And so Dave and Raffi, who by now were really starting to feel scared, they found this washed out gully and they set up their green and maroon tent, but neither man could sleep. And so they just sat outside of their tent telling each other that don't worry, the park rangers are bound to have noticed that we did not come back in time. We only had that 1-day permit. We've exceeded the limit. They're bound to come out here and find us. But in the back of both Dave and Raffi's mind, they weren't so sure that was definitely going to happen. They didn't really know how long it would take for park rangers to notice when people stayed too long. But as Dave and Raffi were speaking, they suddenly noticed far off in the distance something that looked like headlights, like on a car, and it was moving across the horizon. And both Dave and Raffi thought, wait a minute, that's going to be a road right there. All we have to do is go to that road and we're saved. We don't need the park rangers to come rescue us. And so suddenly Dave and Raffi were filled with hope, and they forgot about how thirsty and hungry they were. Then they just crawled into their beds and they fell asleep almost immediately because all they wanted to do was get to the next morning where there'd be daylight so they could hike out and get to that road and get back home. Dave and Raffi woke up early the next morning, and they were very eager to get up and start making their way towards this road, but instead of packing up their campsite and bringing it with them, they decided instead to leave their campsite and leave behind a journal that had some information about who they were and what they were doing in case park rangers came looking for them. And so Dave pulled out a journal from his pack, and he drew a kind of crude map of where this campsite was and where they were going towards this road that appeared to be up on this ridge. And then also Dave included in this note, Dave and Raffi's names, their ages, where they lived, some contact info, and also the fact that they were completely out of food and water, and that if you find this journal, please follow up and make sure we're okay. And so after leaving behind this journal at the campsite, Dave and Raffi set off to go to this road. But after walking for hours and hours up a kind of gradual incline, they reached what appeared to be this kind of third ridge where up and above the ridge was this road. But to get up onto this kind of wall right in front of them was really challenging. There was cactus everywhere, and the gullies that kind of led up to the top of this ridge were very slippery and almost vertical, so nearly impossible to climb. And so this was really a chore getting up there. And you got to remember that Dave and Raffi are already totally exhausted. They have no food, no water, and so this is miserable. But eventually, Dave and Raffi were able to get up onto this ridge, and they looked out, and there was no road. There was nothing. It was just pure desert as far as they could see. And so they had no idea what those lights were that they saw. Clearly, it was not headlights. I mean, for all they knew, it could have been a figment of their imagination. They're desperate to be saved, and so maybe it was possible that they imagined seeing this road. And so as the two men stared in stunned silence at nothingness in front of them, they noticed that a buzzard had actually begun flying in slow circles over their head, almost like it was just waiting for the two men to die so the buzzard could come down and eat them. Now, Dave was ready right then and there to head back to their campsite and just wait, but Raffi was insistent that they just keep on going because you never know, maybe there is a road just a little bit farther along. But after walking for maybe a couple more hours, they did not see a road, and by this point both men were beyond exhausted, and so the two men did finally turn around and painstakingly walk their way all the way back to their campsite. And as they're walking, they're telling themselves, maybe we'll get there and park rangers will be waiting for us, a search party will be here. But when they got to their campsite, there was absolutely no sign that anybody had come to their campsite since they left. Their journal with their note and their crude map and all that was still just sitting right in the middle of their campsite, untouched. And it was at this point that Dave and Raffi's spirits were just totally broken. The next morning was Saturday, August 7th. So Dave and Raffi were now beginning their fourth day in the desert and their third day without any water. Raffi had gotten really sick from drinking his own urine, and Dave had begun to experience all these horrible stomach cramps, very likely from eating unripe prickly pears. Also, Dave's legs were starting to seize up, which made it nearly impossible to walk. And so the two men knew they had no chance of hiking out of here to safety. They really just had to wait for their rescue to come. And so that day, Dave and Raffi attempted, with the little energy they had, to make a huge SOS symbol on the ground using rocks. But after putting the S down and the O down, they didn't have enough energy to collect more rocks to make the last S. And so they did not finish their SOS symbol. And then also Raffi at some point soaked his sleeping bag in fuel and lit it on fire to try to create a smoke signal that somebody might see. But the smoke didn't get high enough, and so it didn't work. And so all that really accomplished was it destroyed Raffi's sleeping bag and also created this terrible stench around their campsite of burning chemicals from having burned the polyester material that made up the sleeping bag. And so by that afternoon, when the sun was right over their head and beating down on them, Dave and Raffi just crawled inside of their tent and laid there in silence. And as they did, they noticed the stones underneath their tent felt kind of cool, and so they cut the bottom of the tent out and just laid directly on these loose rocks inside of their tent. By that evening, when still no rescuers had arrived, Dave and Raffi really began to realize that this could be the end. And so Dave, he grabbed that notebook where they had drawn that crude map of where the lights and the road had been, and he flipped the page, and then he wrote a note to his girlfriend, basically saying goodbye, because he knew he was probably going to die. And then Raffi, he took the journal, and he did something similar, but also included that, he would not allow the buzzards to get them, that they would at least ensure their bodies were intact for their families to find. And then after writing these notes and tucking the journal away, Dave and Raffi crawled out of the tent because by now it's dark out, the sun's not out, it's a little bit cooler outside, and the two men, they sat down and they began having a fairly matter-of-fact conversation about the situation they were in. Both men were very emotional. At one point, Dave began screaming and crying just out of despair. But at the end of this conversation, the two men made a decision, an unthinkable one, that really would only ever be made in a situation like this. And so after both men were on the same page, they crawled inside the tent and zipped it up. It was the next morning, August 8th, 1999, when that park ranger and his volunteer that was with him had walked along the trail towards Rattlesnake Canyon and discovered Dave and Raffi's ransacked campsite. And they had walked up and they had seen all the burned materials nearby, which was Raffi's sleeping bag and other bits of trash they had tried to burn. And then they had gone to the front of the tent and Lance had opened it up, and when he looked inside, he saw Raffi, who was alive. He was laying on his side, and he was only wearing these filthy green shorts, and he just looked totally emaciated and terrible and haggard. I mean, the guy really looked like he was on death's door. And then Raffi, when he saw Lance looking in, he just said, "Please tell me you have some water." And Lance did have some water. He gave it to him. And then Lance, knowing that Raffi was with another person, Dave, he said, "Hey, where is the guy you were with?" And Raffi, as he's drinking the water, just kind of casually pointed out of the tent somewhere off behind where Lance and his partner was. And so Lance and his partner, they turned around and they didn't see anybody. They were just kind of looking off towards the canyon wall, and there was nothing there. And so Lance turned around again and he said, "Are you sure he's over there?" And Raffi, without any expression on his face, just continued to point and said, "Yes, he's right over there." And so Lance, he got up, he turned around and he began walking towards this canyon wall. But before he got there, he nearly tripped over this arrangement of rocks on the ground. And when he looked down at them, he knew someone clearly had arranged these rocks in a particular way. And so, with a growing sense of dread, Lance reached down and he moved aside one of these rocks. And underneath it, he saw Dave's face. It would turn out, the night before, when Raffi and Dave had crawled outside of their tent and began having that very intense conversation, what they were talking about is, what do? We know we're going to die. No one's going to reach us before we die of starvation, or we die of dehydration, or maybe some animal is going to come attack us and kill us. Like, we don't have any hope. And so as they were sitting there, Dave actually pulled out his pocket knife and attempted to cut his wrists, but he couldn't cut deep enough to actually kill himself. And so Dave said to Raffi, "You're gonna have to kill me. And then after that, you're gonna have to kill yourself." And Raffi had agreed. And so Raffi and Dave, they went back inside their tent with no floor. It's just open rocks in the bottom. And Dave, he lied down on his back and he pulled his shirt up and he exposed his rib cage. And then Raffi pulled out his 4-inch pocket knife and he placed it right up against Dave's rib cage. And then with Dave basically egging him on to stab him, Raffi attempted to push the knife into his heart, but he couldn't break the skin. And so Dave, he's now screaming out in pain, but he's still urging Raffi to come on, just do it already. And finally, Raffi does manage to get the knife right through his ribs and into Dave's heart. Dave did not die right away, but Raffi covered his mouth and continued to push that knife in until he did die. And then once Dave was dead, Raffi used the little bit of energy he had to drag his body away from the tent, where he buried him under those rocks. And then Raffi, who now has no energy left, just crawled back to his tent and laid down on those loose rocks inside of his tent and waited to die. But just a few hours later, on the morning of August 8th, Lance, the park ranger, along with his volunteer, had come down and discovered Raffi before he had died. Little did Dave and Raffi know, this campsite where they had been for the past few days was just a 15 or 20-minute walk from their car. 9 months later, on May 11th, 2000, Raffi pled guilty to murder and was sentenced to 16 years in prison. However, Raffi insisted throughout the trial that the reason he killed Dave was because Dave asked him to. It effectively was a mercy killing, and that Raffi intended afterwards to die himself. This was murder-suicide. And Dave's family believed Raffi, and so did another judge. And so ultimately, Raffi would only serve 16 months in prison before he would be released. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's episode and you want to hear more stories like this one, be sure to check out our podcast called the MrBallen Podcast, where we have literally hundreds more stories available right now. Again, the podcast is just called the MrBallen Podcast, and it's available exclusively on Amazon Music.